Greetings to you, myself, Dr. C.NITHYANANDam, Department of Mechanical Engineering. In this presentation, I talked about friction in the subject of engineering mechanics. First, friction. What's a friction? How it is induced naturally? In this block diagram, it is mentioned how the friction force is induced. First, what's a friction? So the friction is act as a resisting force which is generated when two solid surfaces slide against one another. In this diagram, here it is a horizontal rough surface because the friction force is induced only the rough surface. In this world, we are not making 100% smooth surface. Wherever the rough surface is available, that part is automatically and naturally generated frictional force. It is one of the types of force, friction. So this diagram is easily understand what is a friction. It is a horizontal plane. We have placed on one square block on the rough surface. Now we have to apply some force in the left hand direction. It is called as a pushing force. Now what will happen? If the pushing force is more, the rigid body or the object is moves like this. It is a direction of motion. Suppose when the pushing force is less, this block is not in a motion, it is a stationary. But always in rough surfaces, it is a direction of motion. That means the force is applying to this direction. Naturally, the opposite direction, the friction force is induced. So this friction act always parallel to the surface that are contact. So this mechanical contact between these two surfaces, the friction force is always acts parallel to the surface. And then the direction that friction act always in the opposite direction of motion. So it is a basic concept of the friction. Next, we go to the types of friction. Generally in the world, we are having only two types of friction. One is a wet friction and another is a dry friction. So the wet friction is nothing, it is a force of friction between a solid surface and liquid surface. So here the shaft is a solid surface and then the sleeve is also solid surface on the both side, and in between we have to fill some thin film of lubrication. So in between, the friction is in between a solid surface and then the lubricant is a liquid surface. So this friction is called as a wet friction. Similarly, the dry friction is a force of friction between two solid surfaces in contact. It is a rough surfaces, horizontal rough surfaces. So it is solid, and then the square block is also solid. So these two are contact in the surfaces between these two surfaces. This is a solid and this is also solid. So it is called as a dry friction. Then these are all the classifications of dry friction. So wet friction is in between the liquid and solid phases. Then the dry friction applications are more. So we have to take some classifications of the dry friction. The first one is a static friction. In the static friction, always the object remains stationary. So it is a force diagram. It is horizontal surface. It is a given object or a block. So it is having some total weight. First, you take any object, the total weight is always acting vertically downward towards the center of the object. It is a natural force due to the gravitational. Okay. Then the next one, as per the Newton's third law, always it is a action is a weight, normal reactions is in the opposite direction. So it is a normal force or normal reaction. Then it is a applied force. You have to applying the push or pull force. Now what will happen? So the direction of the motion like this. Here the opposite, the static friction is applied. So how to calculate this frictional force? We have to take some force analysis system, so we can easily calculate how much value of the frictional force is required. Suppose when the applying force is less, the block is a stationary. Suppose when the applied force is more, it is called as a sliding friction. So it is a static condition, it is a dynamic condition. So the dynamic or kinetic friction is a second classification. Here when the block is in the motion. So we are having again the two categories, kinetic friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. Sliding, the same concept, but in the applying force is more. But the same thing, but here the block is not stationary, this will be moves like this. And then similarly for the rolling, the same concept is applied here, but in the bottom we have to fix the roller. Example, in the roller suitcase. So we can easily apply the force, but what will happen? Now these two rollers are rolling it on the surface, this block is provided. So it is called as here, this type of motion is called as here rolling friction. So we can easily move this object with less amount of the force. These are all the classification. Next, what is a law of friction? So law is always applying by our Newton's second law. Force is directly proportional to the acceleration. Here the force is a frictional force. Frictional force is directly proportional to the normal reaction. So the normal reaction, F is directly proportional to N. So we have to equating with one constant or coefficient. Here the mu is a constant. So this mu is called as a coefficient of friction. So the limiting frictional force F is applicable for both the static and kinetic. It is a limiting friction. When this limiting friction is generated is only our static friction. How, sir? So here it is a block. When the applying force is given like this, it is a pull type of force. Automatically the opposite direction, the frictional force is induced. What will happen? Here the applied force is equal to the frictional force when the limiting friction is to be overcome to the frictional force. So the limiting friction is applicable for only static friction. So now these two are equal, the block will be in static condition. The next one is the angle of friction. The angle of friction, you take this block, it is having more number of the forces are acting like this. First one, from the point O to some of the weight is acting vertically downward. So as per the Newton's third law, the reactive force is acting in the vertically upward. So it is a R is a reaction force, it is a block, and then it is a frictional force. So applying force is given this direction, so opposite direction frictional force. So you have to take the resolution by using parallelogram law. Now here we know the parallelogram law. So you have to consider this part is divided into two triangle. So you have to calculate this alpha. This alpha is a angle of friction. So here the coefficient of limiting friction is equal to the tangent of the angle of friction. It is just a resolution. This part is called as in our parallelogram law, resultant. So you have to take down the resultant. So you have to split up into two triangle and equating it. So the tan alpha is always equal to the coefficient of friction. Then what is a coefficient of friction? Already we know the frictional force law. F equal to mu n. So the mu is a coefficient of friction. Then what are the advantages? Advantages of the friction is, number one, striking a matchbox in between these two friction. Similarly, spiked shoes of cricket players. We are able to drive automobiles, then the writing on a paper. So these are all the friction applications. We have lot of things in the world. Just I briefly given only 4 examples. Then disadvantages. It is having something. What? The friction produces the heat. Friction produces heat, and then friction produces noise. Suppose when the lubrication, oil or liquid, anything will be evaporated, what will happen? This will be creating the wear and tear of the two surfaces. At the time, more amount of noise is produces, and then the friction wears out the roughing surface. So it will be creating the wear and tear of the any sliding two surfaces. These are all the disadvantages of the friction. Okay. The last part is how to reduce this friction or how to rectify these disadvantages. So the first solution is you have to regularly applying lubricants in the movable part, and then these are the applying oil where it is our home, doors and windows, hinges. In between this inside of the hinges, you have to apply some oil. Similarly, for this the park will be, you have to, the surface will be sometime very rough. So you have to making some polishing. So the next, this suitcase is adding the wheels. We have to reduce the friction on the bottom side. These are all the reducing process, how to rectifying the friction. Thank you.